This is Athens Speakout, number 420, the 12th of December, 12th day, 2017. And we are reviewing Ohio University's Costa Lecture, which was published on the 30th of November, 2017. And the main speaker was H.W. Brands, who was a dynamic speaker from the University of Texas. And he used his 500-student freshman class as the basic text of his general speech to Ohio University, and the room was packed of mostly historians from the undergraduate level to the PhD level. And this photo shows 4 ages of presidents, ending with the 45th president, Donald Trump. Now, Brand said he was cheating a little bit because he wasn't going to say very much about Trump, and you, the audience, can decide. You can vote for or against him, up to you. But he is basically going to talk about the 4 transitional presidents preceding Donald Trump. Now, I will say right off the bat, as a scholar as a PhD, that I am not under any circumstances going to vote for Trump. And I always begin with a slogan: there are presidential dealers. Teddy Roosevelt promoted the Square Deal, Franklin Roosevelt promoted the New Deal, and Harry Truman promoted the Fair Deal, and Donald Trump promoted the Bad Deal.
That's a good slogan, Bob.
That's right. So anyway, according to these photographs, there are 5 photographs, but H.W. Brands is only going to talk about 4 transitional presidents: George Washington, the first president, and Andrew Jackson, the 7th president, and Teddy Roosevelt, the 26th president, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 32nd president. And Lois can give her individual interpretation of her historical background.
Yeah, well, I've had a long interest in history, starting from when I was a little girl. I remember reading about the terrible time in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Actually, this was before California was settled much, of the Donner Party. And that was the first time I really realized that there were real people back in history, a long time ago, long before I was born. But I do have a history BA from Stanford, and I studied the history of education at the University of Michigan. I have a government MA from Ohio University, and a social science MA also from Ohio University. And the one, history is sometimes considered a humanity, sometimes it's considered a social science. But I was emphasizing the history part of social science when I did my last MA in 2007.
Okay, could I just interject here a little question?
Mm-hmm.
When you did this government degree for DeBelco, right? Was that your director? Dave DeBelco?
I don't
Who was the
think
director
so.
of your...
No, I think it was a man who is retired and has passed away, an
Okay.
older man.
All right. But in any case, you emphasized historical mindedness.
Yes.
You were not a behaviorist. That's the other big political science discipline, behaviorism.
Right. No, I was more interested in the historical aspects
Yeah.
of political science.
All right. But you don't remember the title of your thesis?
Well, I don't think that I actually wrote a thesis for that.
Oh, you got it by
MA.
credits.
Yes,
You got it by 5 hours or extra credits or something.
that's right.
Okay.
And that was in 1975, so
Now,
it's
1975.
quite a long time ago
All right.
now.
Okay. So getting back to my credentials, I have one PhD from the University of Michigan, and I've published one real book by the University of Kentucky Press, and one e-book.
That was Hitler in Spain from the Kentucky Press, and what was the e-book on?
The e-book has got a very controversial title,
Yeah,
The American Intervention in the Yugoslav Civil War. And that was a very radical interpretation because the argument at that time was that the president, Clinton, was arguing he was getting involved in the Yugoslav war by condemning ethnic cleansing, and he blamed the war on Milosevic as the ethnic cleanser.
the Serbian.
The
president.
Serbian, right.
Yeah,
And I could see, looking at Spanish nationalism, that they were divided between the Castilians and the Basques and the Andalusians. Spain was a better empire than a nation state, and it took a long time for the Spanish nation to unify.
right, and already they're talking now about
Dividing.
possible, the Barcelona area.
Yeah. So Spain has had a problem in unifying,
Yes,
and now the Balkans have that same problem. The First World War broke out in Sarajevo
yes.
when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand,
Austrian. he
Austrian
was.
emperor,
Heir.
was shot by a Serbian terrorist, a
Yeah.
Bosnian terrorist. And that led to the catastrophe of World War I.
Yeah, the
in which-
different states.
Yeah,
entered
the five
in.
great powers all went to war against one another, and it was an unforeseen war. It lasted for 4 long years.
Terrible
Over the
casualties.
top, machine gun them down. Yeah, it proved that the machine gun was more powerful than the bayonet. It proved that cannons and tanks would be the weapon of, and airplanes. They introduced airplanes.
Right. They also had gas in the First World
Yeah,
War.
okay.
Terrible.
Well, but now from the point of view of Turkey, they got in the war late.
the Turks.
In 1915, on the side of the Germans.
Uh-huh.
The Turks did not get out of the war until 1924. And they didn't go to Paris, and they rejected
The Treaty of Versailles.
the Treaty of Versailles, and then they had separate treaties. Versailles was for Germany, but then they had Trianon for Austria and Bulgaria. They signed 4 separate peace, okay? And Italy was on the side of the Allies, and they were promoted as an honorary great power. And the Bolsheviks, the communists, were excluded as being an impossible revolutionary that couldn't last more than 6 months, okay?
What happened to the Russians was that they had a civil war in their country in 1917, and they dropped out of the war, which very greatly annoyed the Allies, of which the Russians had been a part. So the First World War really led to a lot of terrible things.
Yeah. Now, getting back to my unfinished writing of my memoirs, and I was interested in the 3 great presidents that
Great leaders, yes.
great presidents who Trump mentions. These were transitional presidents. They were President George Washington, number one.
I think you're talking about Brands. Yes.
Brands, H.W. Brands, right. So, but I'm giving you my interpretation of these memoirs.
Right, that picture shows George Washington.
Yeah, okay, fine.
And Andrew Jackson.
Okay, Andrew Jackson was the 7th president, which changed the character of the presidency. And then, from my point of view, Abraham Lincoln was the second great president. From my point of view, Washington was number one, Lincoln was number 2, 16th president, and number 3 was Franklin Roosevelt. And this is the story of the rise of democracy.
But it is the fact that Brands emphasized George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, and then Franklin Roosevelt.
So
those were his 4 people.
Those were his transitional presidents.
Yes.
Okay. Now, since World War II, I, as an American Democrat, see democracy in decline, and President Harry Truman was more conservative than FDR.
Well, I do want to
argue with that. Yes, go ahead.
argue with that a bit, Bob, because at least as far as women and blacks are concerned, American democracy has really expanded since the Second World War.
That's true. Now, getting back to Chester Patch, who introduced Brands, he's Ohio University's, he gave a brilliant introduction to H.W. Brands and pointed out that Brands had published 26 books.
Wow.
And the subtitle of his talk is The 4 Ages of the Selected Presidencies that were transitional. He has an entirely different interpretation
Yes.
of the role of the presidents. And then, according to H.W. Brands, George Washington established a republic by refusing the title of king. That was his great positive contribution.
And he retired after 2 terms.
That's correct.
Which became
a tradition.
Sort of standard.
That's right. That's right. And the 7th president, Andrew Jackson, introduced the popular vote in 1828. And that changed the nature of the Electoral College. And the 26th president...
Well, before we talk about the 26th president, I just would like to point out that Andrew Jackson is less popular, shall we say, today than he was, say, 50 or 60 years ago.
And he was less popular in H.W. Brands' interpretation.
Right, because of incidents like the Trail of Tears.
That's
because
right.
after all, General Jackson had fought the Indians in Florida, and he was responsible for the Cherokee having to move from the Carolinas out to Oklahoma, Indian Territory. And that was a terrible trek, which is remembered as the Trail of Tears.
Okay. Well, anyway, getting back to Brands, the 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt, in 1901 expanded the American empire from Latin America and spheres of influence from Latin America to the Far East. And the 32nd president, Franklin Roosevelt, was famous for winning 4 terms. No other president has ever done that since.
And not only that, they never ever will, because the Constitution was amended to forbid more than 2 terms for the American president.
Okay. So then H.W. Brands said that Teddy Roosevelt's contribution was for expanding the national park system, but he made a sneer that he preserved the buffalo, but he was a hunter of animals in Africa,
Yes, he was a big game hunter.
and he expanded the national. He was a national expansionist
But one of the important
in
things...
the party system.
Yes, one of the important things he did certainly was the Panama Canal, which made it possible to go by sea from New York to San Francisco.
Yeah, his famous statement is, "I stole the canal and I let Congress debate about it." He was an imperialist.
Right, he was. But that cut off the long vessels sailing all around South America to get to the West Coast.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, the elephants are becoming extinct. That was one of his snares. Now, Franklin D. Roosevelt had a contribution for not solving the Depression, because Brands argued World War II did that, and he sneered at Roosevelt that his Social Security bill that was passed only took effect in 1940.
Well, that was when the first people began receiving Social
Right.
Security.
Right.
But they had started taking Social Security out of people's paychecks, I believe, after 1935, when Social Security was first passed.
Well, I think it was in 1936, but we can debate the footnotes about that.
Okay.
Okay, so he made a second sneer at FDR, even though he won 4 terms. He only spoke to Stalin at Yalta and Tehran for a total of 36 hours.
That was in 1945.
1944 and 45. Tehran was in 44.
Yes, and then
45
Yalta.
at Yalta, right? Now, Brands downplays the importance of Winston Churchill, because I would argue that Roosevelt took his cues on the balance of power from Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill convinced Roosevelt that they would have to ally with the bad tyrant Stalin in order to defeat the greater threat, Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, which was true.
Right, and Trump wasn't particularly interested in that. He was not particularly interested in democracy or many positive features.
Well, I think you mean you're
Trump,
talking
Brands,
about
yes, Brands.
Brands.
Yeah, right.
Okay,
Okay,
wrong word.
right. Okay, I'm sorry. Very good. Now, getting back to my philosophy, I put peace first. And that is motivated by religious principles. Catholics, Protestants, and Jews are in the center of American values in 1945. Now, British, French, Swiss, Scandinavian democracy have a slightly different interpretation of democracy, but all of them agree that nationalism is the most important ideology of the 19th century, the 20th century, and the 21st century.
That is the importance of the
Ideology.
nation state and its ideology.
Right.
You know, and there are over 190
Yeah, but
so-called nations in
yeah,
in
but
the
there are
world.
small powers and great powers.
That's true.
And there were 5 great powers that started in World War I and expanded to 7, with Japan and Turkey getting into it. And then there were 7 great powers in World War II. The same coalition started World War II, but not all simultaneously.
That's true.
The Japanese were the first in,
Yes.
and then the
1931 they were.
31, and then they expanded in mainland China in 37,
Yes.
and then the Spanish Civil War broke out, and many people interpreted, that is the left, The Nation magazine and myself, that World War II began in Spain. That was the first war for democracy.
That was in July of 1936.
Right. But that's an underground interpretation. The British say that World War II began in 1939 when they said, we're declaring war.
Right, and September 1, 1939.
Yeah, that's the official outbreak of World War II, according to the standard interpretations.
Yes.
Okay. But I'm saying that World War II was staggered.
Yes.
The seven great powers got into it.
Because Hitler moved against things like taking over Austria.
Right, one by one, step by step.
One by one, step by step.
And that's the thesis of Winston Churchill.
Yes.
Appeasement, okay.
Appeasement was supposedly, especially
because
in
Neville
September,
Chamberlain didn't have a clue what the balance of power was. Neville Chamberlain says, we are bankrupt. We cannot afford a second world war. But he never looked at the map. In order for the Russians and the Germans to fight, they're going to have to march through Poland.
Right.
That's the blindness of Neville Chamberlain.
That was the spark for the September 1939 outbreak of war when Hitler invaded Poland. And then he'd already made a deal with Stalin, so Stalin took the eastern part of Poland as a sort of buffer for himself. But that's the official beginning of World War II.
Well, I learned the heart of the balance of power from my father, who was a veteran of World War I. And he was drafted in 1917, and he fought for 2 long years in France and hated every day of it. So he was a pacifist who became, well, he was a closet pacifist. He didn't know what a Quaker was. It was just a picture on the Quaker box. He never met a Quaker. But during the war, he met a lot of disillusioned isolationists who repudiated Woodrow Wilson, who
entered the war
under false pretenses.
April 1917.
Yeah, but in 1914, when the war broke out in Europe, Woodrow Wilson said, let's be neutral in heart as well as action. We're not going to get involved. And he had a Secretary of State by the name of William Jennings Bryan, who said to Roosevelt, he said to Wilson, you're blind. If you play with these financial powers, the big business, DuPont's, the cotton business, they were selling weapons to the British and French on loan. Sooner or later, they're going to draw you into war, and I'm going to resign in 1915 because you are being pulled into the war by British diplomacy.
Which eventually happened.
All right. Now, in 1916, Wilson was reelected.
Yes.
The slogan was, he kept us out of war.
Yes. But the next April, we entered the war.
This was just like Lyndon Johnson. No, we don't want any wider war. And as soon as he was elected, he started expanding the war in Indochina.
Yeah.
That was a false promise. Well, anyway, the pro-British people, pro-French people drew him into the war. And in April of 1917, the British convinced him, if you don't get in now, we will lose.
Ah, yes.
And Wilson said, we're not an ally, we're an associate power. And we're only going to enter this war to end war, and we'll establish a new international organization called the League of Nations, which will prevent future wars. That was the great idealist.
That was the great idealist.
Who had 2 PhDs.
Woodrow Wilson.
Very unique. but he did not really understand the nitty-gritty of how the balance of power works in everyday activity.
Right. He had been a professor at Princeton.
That's right.
And before he became governor of New Jersey, and that was his stepping stone to the presidency.
That's right. He was elected as a governor, a liberal governor.
In 1912.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, anyway, anyway, getting back to my interpretation of history then. My father was an isolationist, which was a kind of a step toward pacifism, and wanted to protect me from getting involved in World War II, because we could see, and my father could see, in
in the 1930s.
Well, in 1940,
Yeah.
he went down there and voted for Wilkie. Roosevelt is drawing the United States into a Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And that was true.
And he thought Wilkie would keep them out.
Yeah, he voted for Wilkie, but then Wilkie was a secret interventionist.
He made a famous trip during World War II.
Well, Wilkie was actually he was an Indiana electric man. Okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But he was nominated by Republican interventionists as giving aid to Britain. He was an interventionist Republican.
In terms of
In
helping
1940.
Britain. Yeah.
So he didn't campaign against Roosevelt in 1940 as an isolationist. He played his isolationism down.
Uh-huh.
And then he became what they call the one-worlder, and he became the vice president. And he went around selling the League of Nations, was going to be replaced by the United Nations, and he was way to the left of Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah, he made a great world tour during
Made a world tour. And
during
then,
World War
when
II.
Roosevelt was declining health, the Southern Democrats got together and said to Roosevelt, "We won't say a word about your fourth term. We're not going to change horses in the middle of the stream."
Right, that was the big slogan. I remember that as an eighth
You did.
grader.
However, one condition,
Uh-huh.
that you fire Henry Agard Wallace
Oh, yes.
and put in a conservative. And he didn't say, "Well, who do you want?" And they said, "Harry S. Truman
From Missouri.
from Missouri,
A senator.
a border state."
Yes.
And he was an old-fashioned boss. He was in charge of Kansas City, just as the way the Hague machine and the Tammany Hall. He was just a machine politician.
I can remember that there was a great deal of worry when Roosevelt died unexpectedly.
Who was Harry Truman? Nobody ever heard of him.
Yeah, very early in his new term, his
Yeah, but the
fourth
insiders
term.
knew. The insiders knew.
But Truman turned out to be a better president,
That's
they
right.
thought.
But that's another
That's
story.
another story.
Anyway, getting back to Franz now. I say that, and my interpretation is that the United States expansion in World War II was passive because they were fighting imperialism, so that the balance of power brings relative lasting peace, which can work for 10, 20, 30 years. But eventually the balance of power changes because the various powers go across the scale, and everybody wants to be in the center. And that's where Kissinger wanted to put the United States in the center and put Beijing and Moscow out on the two ends, see? And he could be the center of the balance of power.
Kissinger was a very
And
active member of the Nixon and Ford
But he
administrations.
became that because he was raised in Germany, and he knew about the German balance of power through the Metternich system and the Bismarck system, and that they kept, the German kept the peace relatively throughout the 19th century by Bismarck, and there was no war until 1914. When the balance of power was tipped against France from 1815.
Because of Napoleon.
Yeah, the five great powers defeated Napoleon, and France was given a soft peace territorially. They didn't lose any territory, but they put back the Bourbon dynasty.
Yeah,
And
the
France
king.
right. So then, gradually, from 1815, that's the end of the
Napoleonic Wars.
Napoleonic War and the balance of power in 18. They redrew the map in 1815. The great powers, and France then was up at the top, and the five great powers had the weight on this side of the balance of power. Right? You got the scale? Okay. Well, gradually, by 1914, the French, through carefully aligning with the Russians and with the Germans, gradually tilted the balance of power just about even. So that in 1914, the Germans thought they were going to win because they had Prussia and Russia and Austria, the Central Powers.
Yeah, not Russia.
And Prussia was part.
Prussia, yes.
Prussia.
Not Russia.
Yeah, Prussia, Russia. Okay, so
Prussia is a German
all right,
state.
the Metternich and so forth, the Central Powers had the best land army. And the British only had a blockade.
Because they ruled the
And
seas.
the Russians were pan-Slavists. They were very backward, 200 years. So the Germans thought they would easily win in 6 weeks. Now, the Allies also thought that they would win because of the large population in Russia and the power of the British and French sea, and they had America to give them this aid. So they were going to win through finance in the blockade.
And they eventually did.
And that was a risk.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's
World War I again.
well, the balance of power in World War II was basically the same.
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to explain.
Right.
Now, there were two presidential wars beginning with LBJ and going through Richard Nixon.
President Johnson to Nixon.
That's right, President Johnson and Richard Nixon, that were anti-communist, and Kissinger told Nixon privately, as long as the United States is bogged down in Indochina from 1946 to 1975, the United States is pushing the communist Chinese and the Soviet Union together. And we have to, the balance of power, have to split them and put them out on the end of the scale. And we, the Americans, have to hold the balance. Well, that's how the balance of power works. So there were hidden imperialist wars by Nixon. In other words, it brought a relatively lasting peace. And I think that H.W. Brands implies only that the presidents that he names as decisive presidents have to have war before you can get peace. And I disagree with that philosophy altogether.
Yeah.
So in conclusion then, I am 100% in disagreement with H.W. Brands' thesis. To get peace, a president must first resort to war. and George Washington did it. But he forgets that George Washington said no entangling alliances and gave a long-term peace from 1796 to his retirement down to the First World War.
1796 was when he actually retired.
Right. But there were
George
a few
Washington.
small lapses of imperialism. The first being Mr. Madison's war, the War of 1812, over in 2 years. And Madison soon discovered that he made a mistake and sued for a quick peace, and that was the War of 1812.
Well, the thing about the War of 1812 was that it came at what turned out to be the end of the Napoleonic Wars.
That's right.
And the reason that the Americans got into battle with the English was that the English were blocking American trade.
That's right. But Madison made the mistake of assuming that he could take advantage of the British being involved in Russia, and didn't think the British would ever declare war on the United States and invade Washington. That was a surprise.
Right, and they burned Washington.
So
actually.
we had to have, the Americans had to have a quick peace.
Did you ever hear that joke?
What's the joke?
The joke about Washington being burned?
The city of Washington, yeah, what about it?
Well, someone was telling an Englishman,
After the war or during the war?
Oh, well, this was as far as the joke was concerned.
Okay, what's the joke?
He said, "You people burned Washington."
Yeah.
And the fellow said, "Burned Washington? Well, I know that we killed Joan of Arc.
Yeah.
But I didn't ever hear that we had burned George Washington."
Okay. That's an interesting joke.
Yeah.
But I wasn't particularly laughing.
Very true.
Okay. So anyway, George Washington brought a century of relative peace, and there were a few small wars, War of 1812. Then the second war was the U.S.-Mexican War, the 11th president of James Kerr Polk, 1846 to 1848.
That's when we got the Far West.
Well, that was the most successful land grab.
Sure.
The most successful land grab in the history of diplomacy, and it was a quick victory at a very cheap cost.
Yeah, they took over California, Nevada, Utah, Texas,
right, but it
all
began
that
in
area.
Texas. They went from Texas
Right.
across Arizona, New Mexico, and got to California.
Right.
And
Then they got Colorado and Utah and Nevada,
well,
too.
part of Colorado.
Yeah.
The Louisiana Purchase gave the United States land up to the peaks of the Rocky Mountains. So Colorado was...
That was in 1803, yeah.
1803? No.
Louisiana
The Louisiana Purchase was 1800 and...
Okay.
Let's get back to 1812. In 1812,
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson wanted to buy...
No, Jefferson was in power earlier. You must be thinking of Madison.
No, Madison... I just got through Madison.
Okay.
Madison was 2 years, 1814.
1812 to 1814.
Okay, 1848. Okay, that's the Second Imperial War. Now
Right.
let me continue here with my chronology.
Yeah, okay. Because you mentioned 1848 was what we were talking about for
All
a
right.
little while. Now, let's go on to the next
All
one.
right.
After 1848.
1848.
After 1848.
All right, the Mexican War.
That was 1848.
And that led to California and Texas and expansion, and that was the most successful land grab
Right.
in the history of diplomacy from a practical point of view.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, the next wars were not called imperial wars. It's my interpretation. They are presidential wars.
You're talking
Which-
about the Civil War.
Well, the Civil War was an American Civil War. But
All
we're
right.
leaving that out.
Okay, leave it out.
That was a disaster from the point of view of the North and South, and that freed the slaves.
Yeah,
But the Civil War is different than wars of the balance of power against foreign nations.
true.
All right? Fine.
So we
Okay.
go on to 1898.
1898, we have a war that wasn't called an imperial war. It was a war to free
The Cubans,
the Cubans from the Spanish Empire.
right. But what happened was we took over the Spanish Empire, or at least parts of it.
Let's talk about let's talk
As
about the
about
United States. Let's talk about the
United
United States.
States,
The United
right.
States
We in
then
the United States.
said they were fighting to free Cuba, and the Democrats were very much opposed to that claim.
However, the USA wound up with the Philippines and Puerto Rico, which were part of the Spanish Empire.
The United States then de facto became
An
a
imperial.
hidden empire. It didn't say we're an empire.
Yeah,
Now, Roosevelt said he was an empire. Roosevelt was proud to be an imperialist.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Theodore Roosevelt,
We're talking
right,
about,
right.
yeah.
All right.
He was involved in the Spanish-American War
Okay.
in 1898. Yeah.
So that was the Third Imperial War.
What's the next one?
All right. The next war was the long Indochina War of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Now, they didn't claim that they were imperialists. They said they were anti-communists, and they had an ideological crusade against communism.
Right.
And they didn't really understand the balance of power, except Henry Kissinger did.
Uh-huh.
And Henry Kissinger said to Nixon, I can get you elected president, but I cannot win the Indochina War. And as soon as you withdraw from Indochina, you will be able to divide China and Beijing,
China and Russia.
Russia,
Soviet Union, as
and
it was in those days.
Put them out on the two edges.
Right.
Got it now?
Soviet
Okay.
Union.
All right. So that was a de facto war of imperialism declared by presidents without the participation of Congress.
Right, Vietnam. Well, they were talking about keeping the communist Chinese from taking over Southeast Asia. That was part of the excuse, anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the basic thesis of Brands is that all presidents have to win a war before we can get to peace. And I say that peace comes from the values of Christianity and Judaism, which were, you get peace.
And those are basic American values.
That's right, up until recently. Now, God only knows where America is going, because world democracy is not the same as democracy as we understand it in the West, in the United States.
There are a lot of countries that call themselves democracies that
Yeah, but how does that,
Really are.
how is that defined? Okay.
Yes. Well, that's part of the
So
story.
have we ended a little bit early? What time is it?
Well, we're almost ready to end. I know it's just a couple of minutes left here, Bob.
Okay.
So just in summary, you've been talking about the question of imperialism
Well, do you
and the balance of power.
do you have more sympathy with these 4 ages of the presidency? Or do you agree with H.W. Brand's
Yeah.
thesis that You have to win a war before you can get peace? How do you get peace? Through
Well,
winning wars?
I don't know. That does seem to be very problematic, doesn't it? Very problematic.
I just disagree 100%.
Yeah, but it is interesting that Brands did talk about Washington, Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt
Okay, he says we have only 2 minutes, so,
as the four ages
okay, all right.
of the expansion
Right.
of America's working with the world.
Okay.
And you have emphasized, of course,
Okay.
the importance of the balance of power.
In any case, Lois and I both agree that debate is the oxygen of democracy, and we have to keep the debate going
Right.
in the United States
Yes.
politics. And both you and I are hoping that the Democrats will win more seats in the House of Representatives.
And the Senate.
Well, that's harder to do. But the House of Representatives, I'm pretty sure the Democrats will win some seats.
In 2018.
In 2018.
Next year, yeah.
But the Republican Party seems to be splitting
Yeah,
into the conservative Republicans who believe in the balanced budget, believe in the gold standard and sound money, because the whole world is on fiat money.
right now, yes.
It's all on electronic money.
Yes, but the dollar is the standard, too.
It is the so-called standard, but
Right.
it's been declining.
Yeah.
And the Chinese are gaining. Nobody knows how much gold the Chinese have. And the Chinese industrial power is taking over American industrial power. So China, with its population, in the long run, may defeat the American claim to be a great power.
Yes. Not in our lifetime, however.
Not in
Bob.
our lifetime.
No, you're 87, I'm 85. We're not going to see anything quite like that.
We could die in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, and in my case, I have faith I might even last 10 years.
Oh.
You have less faith in yourself.
Well, it's always interesting to debate with you, Bob, that's
Okay.
for sure. We've been doing it for over 60 years. We've been married for over 60 years, so. Oxygen,
Is the no
Debate.
The debate is the oxygen of democracy. It keeps it alive.
right. And you are
Debater,
a debater?
and you are too.
Yes, I am too.
But we debate from different angles.
That's true,
We have different attitudes toward the priorities.
yeah. Okay, I
Good.
think that this must be our last hurrah for this show.
For this
Anyway.
show.